I don't think Zack Snyder's DC movies were bad by any means, but I'll never understand the online obsession over the Snyderverse. Look, I get why a lot of people like Zack Snyder's vision as a filmmaker, but I think his decisions for this universe were questionable. Granted, it's also the old Warner Brothers' fault for putting him in that position and then screwing him over, but let's take a look at how the whole DCEU went down, and how Zack Snyder played a big part in that. So sit back, get your pitchforks lubed up or whatever angry mobs do, and let's break down the Snyderverse. Starting with Man of Steel. Man of Steel is one of the most underrated comic book movies of all time. I found it to be an interesting way to start a cinematic universe because of its tone and atmosphere, but in a way, it set this universe up for failure. Superman is meant to be a bright beacon of hope in a dark world, and this movie is so bleak. It made it feel like there could be nothing fun to see in this DC universe. Man of Steel is a great movie on its own because of its unique style that you wouldn't typically see in a Superman movie. It also has what might be my favorite score of any comic book movie in history. It has emotional beats about Clark finding his place in the universe, and Henry Cavill was born to play Superman. If it were me rebooting the DC universe, Henry Cavill is the only thing I would keep because I really love him as this character. As a movie, Man of Steel is so underrated, so although I think this movie was entertaining, it's a strange choice to have Zack Snyder start this universe. And if you thought Man of Steel was bleak, just wait until Batman vs. Superman. I think that's where the cracks really started forming because there is no joy in this movie whatsoever. Not that a movie like this is supposed to be a happy joke fest, but why is this movie with Superman such a dreadful experience clouded with death? Also, Superman straight up murders someone in the beginning of the movie, Batman brands people so they'll get shanked in prison, and we get a shot of Bruce Wayne's bat cheeks. Never mind, 10 out of 10. It bothers me that this movie tries to cram so much plot into its runtime when it really didn't need to be that deep. Sure, the director's cut goes into far more detail, but in my opinion, if you can't fit your plot about two dudes in capes fighting each other into a 2.5-hour runtime, maybe you shouldn't be making a movie like this. I get that there's some studio interference and maybe Warner Brothers had a hand in including the rest of the Josstice League, but I also felt that Zack Snyder tried way too hard to make his movie complex, when a movie like this doesn't need to be. The constant need for director's cuts gets tiresome after a while, but I have to give credit where it's due. I do believe that Zack Snyder did a great job showing the resentment between these two characters. The action is entertaining and the movie is quite suspenseful at times. Look, I don't hate this movie, but I can't deny that it's somewhat messy. So after establishing this dark, fucked up universe, we go straight into Suicide Squad.
So that's it? What, we some kind of Suicide Squad?
He said it! He said it!
A movie with so much studio interference that it completely changed the tone. Now, I don't know how good the director's cut of this movie would have been, but David Ayer directed Fury and End of Watch before this. I would imagine it was at least decent compared to this dumpster fire that Warner Brothers put out. This movie felt like it was made by some employee at Hot Topic. It's crammed with licensed music, bad humor, and terrible pacing. Not to mention, it doesn't really follow the title Suicide Squad. One character dies. One.
That just makes no fucking sense. I mean, it's just bullshit. Fuck.
None of the characters are fleshed out, and by the end, they don't feel like a family whatsoever. But if there's one thing I'm gonna give Zack Snyder, it's the way that he fixed Joker after this iteration we got in Suicide Squad, because this was just awful. It's certainly unique and it's a new interpretation, but it became incredibly difficult to believe that this was the arch nemesis of this Batman. So yeah, Suicide Squad was a giant mess. At this point, I was starting to lose hope in DC, but then we got Wonder Woman. This should have been the movie to kickstart the DC universe. This was the only movie in this universe so far that was loved by both the audience and the critics. It was a fun entry, and that's what this universe desperately needed. I don't think Gal Gadot would be my top choice for Wonder Woman. Regardless, it's a really entertaining movie. It has all the fun superhero movie tropes and copies some previous movies we had already seen, but still, This should have been what set the tone for the DC universe, because this is just fun all around. You don't go right out of the gate with a dreary, apocalyptic Superman movie from Zack Snyder. And that's not his fault. It's the studio. And that's why we got Joss Whedon's Justice League. It felt like he was trying to make these characters interact with each other the same way the Avengers did.
Man, my toes hurt. I don't even understand the physics of how my toes hurt.
And that's kind of hard to do after we just saw two really dark Zack Snyder movies that did not portray these characters that way at all. We had this dumb post-credit scene where they're talking about brunch. This was not the Avengers, and it shouldn't have tried to be. This movie did nothing to accelerate the DC universe, and from here, I think everyone knew things were going to go downhill. But surprisingly, we followed up with a $1 billion Aquaman movie that was pretty fun for the most part. I recently watched this at a hotel while I was kinda drunk, and I forgot how fun this movie was. Jason Momoa practically plays a rock star under the sea, and to me that's all the info you need to sell people on it. James Wan really incorporated his style into this project by making it his own and giving us something that was visually captivating. The movie is beautiful to look at and makes for a great visual spectacle. The funny part is, the visual element is paired with some of the funniest dialogue and line delivery I've ever heard.
Are you saying they executed her?
What are you doing here?
Not to mention, there's far too many villains, and Aquaman is not Aquaman. But at least it made people take him seriously. But we all know what role this man was destined to play. Now we move on to
Shazam!
another one that I found pretty fun. I didn't really feel that Billy Batson felt the same in Shazam form. Zachary Levi was a little more cartoonish. At this point in the DC movies, it was hard to believe it was connected to the Snyderverse. The movie wasn't mind-blowing, but it was still a fun watch that we hadn't seen before, and I was genuinely excited to see this character interact with the rest of the DC universe. Yeah, that didn't happen. And at this point, Superman felt completely removed. Getting a shot of him without his face just hurt my soul. Oh yeah, and then we got Birds of Prey, the constipation of Barbie Quinn. This is certainly one of the most forgettable movies in the old DC universe. Harley Quinn is certainly the best part about it. Margot Robbie continues to bring fun energy that we love about the character. While some of the scenes with Harley Quinn were really fun and brutally R-rated, the movie itself was pretty forgettable. I forgot this one even existed. It really tried to follow the same formula as Deadpool with the story structure and the narration by Harley, but it didn't do it well. And I can't even remember who all the side characters were. This should have been a solo Harley Quinn movie because she was the only enjoyable part about it. I still remember seeing this in an empty theater on opening night and thinking, yeah, this DC universe is gonna die. And to solidify that statement, we got Wonder Woman 84. I'm gonna say this as nicely as possible.
It's the biggest piece of dog shit.
I'd rather drag my balls over sandpaper than watch this again. To me, this was the nail in the coffin. Many of the scenes felt like filler, it was boring, and it brought none of the great qualities from the first movie. I still don't know how this movie got approved. It honestly might have been the worst movie in the DCEU. It was the only one that gave me the urge to leave the theater. The villains felt so disconnected from our hero, and the overall impact on this universe was so confusing for the timeline we had been introduced to with Man of Steel. I think this one was by far the worst movie we got in this universe. And then we got what could have been our original Justice League, the Snydercut. While I think the Snydercut is a great movie, I'm trying to picture it coming out when it was supposed to come out, and to be honest, I think people still would have had problems with it. The reason why is because the Snydercut is 4 hours long, and chances are, we would have had a shorter version of that in theaters where we missed out on key information. Regardless, I thought the Snyder Cut was a great movie. It gave us far more depth on these characters that we were just introduced to, and it carries the tone of the last couple Snyder movies. That being said, I still felt that this tone was a weird way to kick off the DC universe. I absolutely love when stories go dark, but there wasn't really enough build-up toward a dark tone. One of the weirdest parts of this movie is in the scene where Wonder Woman beats the shit out of some criminals and bashes a dude's head against the wall. Then tells a little girl, "Follow your dreams, bitch." What? That was probably my biggest issue with Snyder's vision. It always felt that he wanted to make the PG-13 characters R-rated, but that's not entirely his fault. The studio said do what you want, and he did just that. But I prefer to see Zack Snyder given the right characters to work with. So by this point in the DCEU, or the Snyderverse as it was called after this release, half of the actors were already checked out of this franchise or they were in jail. Warner Brothers' only goal with DC was to make profitable movies. There was no plan for a universe or any big events. But within that era, we did get some great movies and some not so great. But let's start with the movie directed by the guy that is kicking off the new DC universe. Call me a James Gunn fanboy or whatever, but you can't deny that this dude has been incredibly successful with comic book films. The Suicide Squad had so much personality and James Gunn's style that it was hard not to love. From the first 15 minutes, you know what movie you're in for. James Gunn also manages to make lesser known characters shine in their own unique way. Polka Dot Man and Ratcatcher are not characters that I pictured myself being invested in. This movie also follows the title, The Suicide Squad. People actually die. Look, I don't know if James Gunn's DC universe will be amazing or not, but I completely understand why they would choose him to run the studio because of his track record, and this was the first DC movie in a while that made me give a shit about the characters, and it showed us a balance of the dark and the light. Okay, with that down, what's next? Black Adam. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I kinda like this one.
What's this, you fucking piece of shit?
And the sad part is, I think it would have been even better if Zack Snyder directed it. Before I get to that, I gotta say that this is probably one of the dumbest movies in this universe, but it's so fun. Dwayne Johnson hyped this thing up to be like the Dark Knight, when I'd say this has the same tone as Spy Kids.
Now, what you're going to see here is why the hierarchy of power in the DC universe is about to change.
Is it
By the end of the movie, we get to watch a wrestling match between The Rock and Satan. If that doesn't tell you something about this movie, I don't know what will. And yet, I found it to be a really fun time, and I enjoyed all of the new characters like Dr. Fate and Hawkman. I guess you could say Dwayne Johnson plays somewhat of a different character than he usually plays, but it still wasn't how I envisioned Black Adam whatsoever. But hey, I enjoyed watching him beat the shit out of people. The reason I think Zack Snyder would make a great Black Adam movie is because this is the type of character that fits his style. I think he could have brought that violent nature to the big screen and it would have felt right because after all, Black Adam is a villain, in case Dwayne Johnson doesn't know that. Of course, I would prefer that Zack Snyder has a better script to work with, but I think he would have made an amazing Black Adam movie. And I gotta admit, the mid-credits scene did have me hyped, which DC hadn't done for me in a while. I was 100% down for Black Adam vs. Superman. This was one of the few movies post-Snydercut where I felt that the universe was still alive. It was so refreshing to see Henry Cavill back in the suit. But then, just like that, the universe was coming to a close. James Gunn was hired by Warner Brothers and announced that he was starting a new DCU. As much as I wanted to see this showdown, looking back at all the other movies of this universe, it made sense because this world was dying and the profits were going down. So let's speedrun through 2023 where we got the remainder of the DC movies. Shazam 2 was a great reminder that this universe was dying. Which sucks because I love David F. Sandberg as a director, but this movie felt entirely forgettable. I felt like the drastic difference between Billy Batson in adult form and child form was way too exaggerated. It almost felt like they were completely different characters. The movie itself wasn't necessarily bad, I just didn't care at this point, and maybe the announcement of the rebooted DC universe kind of hurt the perception of this film. Maybe if Black Adam was the villain, I would have cared more. So after Shazam 2, we got The Flash, which was supposed to be a soft reboot of the DC universe, and it was supposed to be a culmination of everything that's happened so far, but the movie felt kinda messy. This one was doomed from the start with Ezra Miller. I never really saw him as the Flash in the first place, because the way he interacts with people felt so weird and off. It took a more annoying version of him to make this one more interesting. And honestly, he did a better job playing Stoner Flash over the real one. The movie had some emotional elements that worked, and I liked Supergirl, but the CGI and the cheesy nature of it killed it for me. Flashpoint is such a large-scale story in the comics, and it's unfortunately another one I could have seen Zack Snyder directing. It's a dark story that's supposed to feature a Batman that kills, a war between the Atlanteans and Amazons, and a truly twisted villain.
Remember when you were making out with your first girlfriend, and you came right as she touched your leg? It was me, Barry. I jerked you off.
I think with the right script that's faithful to this comic book, Zack Snyder would dominate with this type of movie. As for Blue Beetle, it was fine. I'm happy that they're keeping the same actor for the new universe because I thought he did a great job in the role and made this character feel really fun, but the movie itself was meant for streaming and that's almost where it went. There's a level of cheesiness that I never thought I would see in a superhero movie. I think the word family is mentioned more than we hear it in Fast and Furious. This one was also fairly forgettable and it was another flop at the box office. So then we get to the final movie of the DCEU. Man, I was really hoping this universe would go out with a bang, but it went out with a whimper.
First you steal your brother's throne, then you steal his woman? Aquaman, shame on you.
No.
Aquaman 2 was another forgettable movie and such a downgrade from the first. This was the final nail in the coffin. Black Manta felt like a cartoon character and Aquaman was just full Jason Momoa at this point. It felt like he already knew he was going to be playing Lobo, so he just decided to say fuck it and be himself. This movie drags like a motherfucker and lacks some of the originality of the first one. Patrick Wilson is probably the only redeemable part of this one, and I enjoyed the brotherly relationship between him and Arthur. It was another empty theater to walk out of, and I was happy to know it was the end of the DCEU, also known as the Snyderverse. So now that it's over, let's look at this universe as a whole. How did we go from the depressing Superman movie to the buddy road trip that was Aquaman 2? Well, that's the result of a studio with no plan and no respect for their characters. It's the result of letting someone start a cinematic universe with a bleak Superman. There's a reason people are so excited to see a Superman on the big screen again. There was hardly any connective tissue or consistency in this universe. It became hard to believe that Batman vs. Superman Aquaman 2 took place in the same universe. I think how you establish a cinematic universe is such a new concept and you only have one chance to make a good first impression. But how is it that the only movie of this universe to crack $1 billion was the first Aquaman? Maybe people saw it as a fresh start after the disappointing Josstice League. I still think that is part of what killed this universe because I think that is what should have brought the franchise to greater heights. The thing is, I think this universe would have failed even if Zack Snyder got to release his version in theaters. Sure, I was curious to see the post-apocalyptic Justice League movie that Zack Snyder was setting up, but I don't know if it would have felt earned. And I would have trouble seeing another evil Superman because it seemed like Zack Snyder was leaning into that heavily. I've always had a soft spot for DC since I was a kid watching the Justice League cartoons. These were always my superheroes, and I think they deserve way more recognition than what they've received. Sure, there's still some DC movies from this previous universe that I can come back to and enjoy, but overall, I think this universe was a failure due to the collaborative efforts of the old Warner Brothers and Zack Snyder. That being said, I'd still be down to see him direct a DC movie in this new universe. If Snyder is given the right characters and script, I think he can do wonders. I just hope this cult online doesn't ruin the chances of that ever happening. So yeah, that's my take on the old DC universe, Snyderverse, whatever you want to call it. What are your thoughts on this past era of DC movies? Do you think they should have carried this universe on, or are you happy that we're getting a reboot? Let me know in the comments down below. I'm hoping we get another Flash movie with a Flash that doesn't run from the cops. So yeah. Bye.